All right. So like all Charleston Conference presentations, this is very august and certainly to be a very serious session that involves battles in your library. Some of you probably have war wounds. We're going to share some of them today. But aside from the rock and sock robots, really the point of this, this is a lively discussion session. We actually are leaving a tremendous amount of time, if we don't talk too long, to actually have that conversation, because it's really the point of what we're trying to do with this, and hopefully the context will give you the reasoning behind that. But anyways, just to give you an idea of who you have in front of us, I'm Brad Warren, Associate Dean of Library Services at the University of Cincinnati, and we have Tudesco from Yale University, and her tell-all tale of the gore fest at the Bass Library at Yale. You came to the right place. Meth at Florida State, and Boaz, I can never say your last name correctly, from Lehigh University. It's all right, but you're welcome. I never should do last names in everyone. But anyway, so I wanted to talk about is really give you an idea about what we're going to try to cover here. Why this topic? I think that there's some time to provide some context with that, because to be quite honest, just talking about war stories is something we could do at a bar, and we really want this to be something a little bit more interesting and not have to be like a wedding reception also. We have some themes, I think, that went in our own discussions in putting this together, and when we shared our stories that we thought sort of surfaced, and I think that these are things that that you can identify with, but they will be out later to help sort of guide the discussion, and obviously they're only the ones we talked about within our sort of prep for this. You have your own. We'll be sharing our stories in all their gory detail, and really to spend most of the time to talk with all of you. If you want to use this as a session for catharsis, that's great. But to be quite honest, we really do want to talk about how we can approach this, because I think as a trend, this is something that we shouldn't see as being acceptable. And how do we shift the conversations? So some of the themes that I think that so think of these things as we share our stories. And I want to get a little bit of background as far as the why. It's not as if we haven't been converting library spaces that were taken up by collections to other uses, but I have to say that probably up until fairly recently, it depends on their institution, but it usually was starting in areas where it was fairly simple. It was journals that had electronic surrogates. It might be in STEM fields in which they were going more into journal literature and electronic in the first place. But I think for many of us, certainly all the people up here, have experienced that a lot more as we begin to encroach into arts and humanities territory. And I think it's safe to say that 2.5 million plus collections and the nostalgia of browsing sometimes really get into the way of, I think, being able to make rational decisions. So you see this piece about sometimes the data doesn't matter. And I think that that's a really important theme that comes out. There's acknowledgement. Print usage is down, and both we as librarians and also administrators around campus look at the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of square feet that collections are taking up, and it looks like dead space. So we really do need to invest our time into these spaces, and what a better use of that is, whether it is for collections or different ways of looking at it, or for different sort of programmatic purposes. But at the same time, I think that we're also seeing trends within higher ed as a whole, where arts and humanities faculty may feel under attack, where the liberal arts education as well is seen as under attack, because it doesn't necessarily contribute to the economy. Take it as you will. I mean, we're certainly in an environment where everybody can have an opinion, which somehow becomes reality as opposed to facts. And I think that we can't dismiss these concerns as antiquated. This has to do with people's identity, both faculty that teach on your campus, or faculty, if you call them your librarians, your staff. There are people, I think, that are feeling threatened, and also changes in the values of education. And in the middle of all of this, everybody who is on the front line, whether it's librarians or staff who are interacting with people, are hearing and receiving, and on the front lines of receiving this frustration. Sometimes, as I would say, sort of pontification, or a principled stance, or somebody will orate in front of everybody and say how awful this is. But sometimes it can actually be quite aggressive. And we have examples of that within the people who are up here to talk about their stories. So what we really need are allies. People who, and our allies need to come from the places, for the people who are making decisions about the collections, people who are publishing the materials that we are collecting, and we also need to have discussions with higher education administrators as well, and understanding that, that their faculty on campuses are often expressing their displeasure in places that they may feel that it's safe to do it, but it doesn't mean that it's appropriate. So I'm going to move on to my story. So that's the context, what we're going to talk about. We're going to share our stories, and I'm going to bring these themes back up again to help us with our conversation, our lively discussion. So a little bit of background. I started at the University of Cincinnati last August. Before that, I was at Yale, and that plays in a little bit to this as well, because I'm really familiar with the other project. So I found out about a faculty enrichment center which was being put into the library, about a 10,000 square foot space, soon after I started, within the first month. It was slated for construction at the beginning of this year, with opening in September of this year. Within that space, it was kind of a dead zone. There wasn't any really programmatic use, but it had 100 seats for students, and it wasn't in a 24/7 space. So at the University of Cincinnati, we have a floor that is 24/7 during the academic year. This wasn't in that space, but it still represented a significant amount of space for students. We met with student leaders in September of last year, so that's 1 month in, and they were concerned, but I think they were also confused, thinking that we were renovating the space for them. So 4 months into a brand new job, yeah, I was looking at these pictures of this lovely space. Yes, the building was built in 1978. And this is the remaining reference government documents, microforms, and media space. And it's on the same floor that where our 24/7 space is. And all I had to do, it was like being in two completely different cities. I was in the middle of mayhem, noise, vibrancy, and all I had to do was walk into this space, and all of a sudden, all of the energy would just get sucked out. And I would sit there and look, and it was just a pass-through space. Now, admittedly, I'm smart enough to know that being 4 months into a job, you don't do facility projects, and you don't talk about having to lead, and you don't talk, and you don't start interacting with people who are still trying to figure who you are, figure you out, and haven't even established trust to start talking about doing a facilities project in which you're getting rid of about 4,000 linear feet of materials that had been reviewed about 4 years earlier. Unfortunately, though, we had to. So in these conversations with library faculty, staff, and teaching faculty, it became apparent that we needed a more sophisticated solution. So even though I could look at all of this and say I cannot understand why we have all of this and why people think it's interesting and I don't observe a single use, I understand it's anecdotal and it's not that simple. So in the midst of all of our discussions, it became pretty apparent that nobody was questioning the need to be able to create the space for students, but that tossing all of the books was not an option either. And I think somebody even from one of the librarians said the barbarians are storming the gates. And I said, what do you mean by that? Because I'd never heard that phrase before, at least in relation to reference books. And I even was using the concept of reference books was not a sword that I was going to impale myself on either. So it certainly wasn't a great beginning, but it happens. So in the midst of all of this, we also had discussions with teaching faculty, and so the arts and sciences group, we're a unionized shop. And so I went to the Arts and Sciences group is large enough that they had their own faculty senate and gave a presentation about what we were doing. And at this point we had determined we needed a different solution aside from just weeding. So we knew we were going to keep things, but they weren't going to be where they were. And we were just giving a heads up. We hadn't decided what was happening, but we wanted to at least begin the conversation. And in the middle of that, I had a faculty member who was with, I would say, barely controlled rage stand up and just yell, "This is a travesty, I cannot believe you're doing this, and oh, by the way, it was ridiculous to put a coffee shop at the library, and when it used to be books." I mean, it was irrational. And what was interesting is in the midst of all of this, we had already said we haven't decided anything, we haven't done this, we haven't done that. He didn't hear a single word. And I think I was expecting the worst, so it really didn't bother me too much that he did that. And I said, thank you for your feedback. And, but at the same time, I was also thinking about Yale. Because this is the same time frame where people would say, oh, do you miss Yale? And I would just point to a couple articles in the Yale Daily News about the Bass Library project and say, no, I don't miss being at Yale in any way, shape, or form because that was my project before I left. You're welcome, Sarah. So anyways, the piece of this is that while we're trying to manage faculty expectations and library faculty who also were upset in a varying range, nobody was at least questioning the need of having to create this space for students. But what to do with the collection, a collection that on the surface doesn't seem like something that you should care too deeply about, was turning into a symbol of something else, to the point that there were certain faculty, library faculty members that I did not want to be engaging with teaching faculty because it's not about necessarily towing the company line, but it also wasn't going to help manage the mayhem, so to speak, that was beginning to happen. Simultaneously, we're asking the students, what do you want us to do with this space? So that was the fun part, but and aside from the fact they asked for beanbags, that's where the big no is. And there's also the concept of a strip club, and I mentioned this didn't come from Florida. Not Florida State, though. And they wanted us to put Beyonce into the library and a place for them to quietly scream, which I thought was nice. But anyways, so we're managing this part of it, and they still think we're renovating a space for them, not for the faculty. So we're managing two different audiences right now as well, which is a bit difficult. The last piece of this, and the reason that I did, that really was the inspiration behind doing this kind of a story, is that there was a discussion on ARL directors about this topic as a whole, in which Susan Gibbons, the university librarian, well, not right now, they're hiring, by the way, in case you're curious, but was talking about the story at Yale, and this was certainly not something that was unusual. And I'm sure many of you who have been working in academic libraries for a while probably have your own war stories of this. But what really came out was that it was hard to tell why, what the reasons were. We had lots of theories, but at the same time, and there was something that she said in the midst of this that I thought was really important, is that it is not fair to the librarians and the staff on the front lines to be subjected to this. It is not their job, and it's up to us as the administrators to convey very clearly that we need to be able to have these conversations, and we need to be able to have them in a way that is not, it can be heated, but it needs to be civil. And I think that it sort of clarified to me that what we needed was to begin having conversations with people outside of service, outside of the service arena, and sort of seeing these stories and just thinking, oh, this is just how we have to deal with business, and they're just behaving badly and we have to deal with it, but to actually say this is not acceptable, and how do we shift conversations away from this and to work with others so that it's on their radar. It can also begin to think a lot more creatively and purposefully about how they're having conversations with faculty about collections on the campus. So what we really want to do then by the end of this is to transition from horror stories to constructive conversations. And really that's where all of you when we get to the end of this. And I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah.
Thank you, Brad. So I'm Sarah Tudesco. I'm the Program Director for Assessment and User Experience Research at Yale University Library. I was part of the team that did a lot of assessment work about the renovation project before work really began. And I was working with Brad at that particular moment in time. And when he took the job in Cincinnati, I gamely, I guess, volunteered to manage the project going forward. So that's kind of how I became involved in this particular initiative. But the actual story begins. Begins actually way back in 2013 when Yale announced that it was increasing the size of its undergraduate population. This is a significant increase in that particular enrollment, moving from a class of 5,400 students up to 6,200. They were going to be doing this by building additional housing. It was going to be a significant project, and this would be happening slowly over time. 200 students every year, starting in 2016. 2019 saw the last of the new students coming in. So we are now at this new capacity for undergraduates. So, you know, you always want to take advantage of those moments in time, and Susan Gibbons, the university librarian at that time, used that opportunity to negotiate some things for the library to be able to support, you know, the new students. And that included a new position for an undergraduate support librarian, more collections funds to accommodate the increase in FTE that may have some impact on our licensed electronic resources. I think a topic of particular note for Charleston Conference. And finally, a little bit of money to renovate a library. The Bass Library, which is the undergraduate library that, you know, it's not the undergraduate library, it's a library that undergraduates use, kind of adopted as their own. And so this is a picture, this is the renovated Bass Library. Now, the Bass Library had actually undergone a significant renovation back in 2007, so not too long ago, where they really transformed the space from a dark and dingy underground library into a much different sort of environment. It was a really successful renovation. It was and became a real important place to study. It was really at capacity, and that's before they increased the number of undergraduates. Although this is a prime location for undergraduates, all students use this particular library. So it's kind of it was an interesting case study. The library itself is an underground library. Just to give a sense of what the campus looks like. So the first picture shows Sterling Memorial Library. That's really the heart of the Yale University Library system. It is a major focal point on campus. It is got the huge stack tower, a couple million volumes in that building, and the little dog that's on the green there is sitting on top of the Bass Library. The Bass Library is underneath that green space. It has a couple of courtyards that are sort of parallel to each other in front of that space. So as you can see, so this is it's sort of it's connected campus. It's two libraries. They're connected underground. We often think of them administratively together. The person who manages frontline services is the manager of frontline services for Sterling and Bass. These are things that we think about together. All right. And so, you know, it had a major renovation. This renovation was really about increasing the number of seats. That was really the primary goal. We're going to have more undergraduates. We need to have more spaces in our libraries to accommodate them. And, inevitably when somebody says this, you should always be a little bit cautious. It's not going to be a big deal. No, it's not going to be a big deal. It's sort of a lightweight renovation. Like I said, the major renovation had already happened. So the whole thing was going to be a little bit of a shuffling. There's a lot of logistics that were involved in this project. In the Sterling stacks, there was a project to move some of the books that were classed in our old proprietary Yale classification system. These are older materials, very low usage. Some of the stuff was not completely cataloged during the recon process. So we had the opportunity to attack that part of the collection and really sort of get better records for that stuff, and also move it to the library shelving facility. We offering to reclass a few key sort of series and titles into a Library of Congress classification. We had the opportunity to completely reshuffle the stack tower, so it's now going to be organized from A to Z in an understandable sort of range, and really make it so that we have capacity to grow there. So that, because we're still accumulating a lot of print materials, so we would have the ability to keep adding new materials in the stack tower for many years to come. As our remote shelving space starts getting filled up, this is something that we were thinking about. Just trying to future-proof ourselves, and that was all part of the process. And part of that process would be, a couple, maybe a half of the Bass collection would be moved to the Sterling stacks. Not a big deal. Not a big deal. However, we realized very quickly that it was going to be a bigger deal than we thought. During that sort of initial phase of the project being announced, there was some faculty pushback. They were a little concerned. All of a sudden we were touching books. We were touching books in ways that they didn't quite understand. And so we really that really activated a couple of things. Our university librarian ended up making an address to the faculty senate. This was a couple of years ago, keep in mind, it's a couple of years ago. They basically formulated a faculty advisory committee, and where she worked really closely with them to help them understand some of the issues that were involved with this logistics process, talking a little bit about the usage of usage of the collection, specifically about undergraduate usage, and sort of bringing them along on our thought process and on the project. And, you know, building up that support from the faculty group. And they were very supportive in that process. I did a presentation around 2014, 2015. I'm the assessment librarian, so I bring a lot of slides with a lot of data visualizations. And I talked a little bit about what I was seeing about engagement in the collection and showing sort of the trends that we were seeing, especially when it came to undergraduate usage. That really had the faculty expressing a lot of concern. They believed, especially the humanities faculty, that students weren't engaging in the print culture and in the print book in the same way, which they are not. That is absolutely true. But they thought that was a tragedy, and we needed to do something about it. We, the library, needed to do something about it. But the reality is as we did our studies of how the undergraduates engaged with work in the library, we really understood that undergraduates are very focused on getting their work done. They're focused on getting their work done, and so what was driving them was not the beautiful print collections. What was driving them was, I need to get my assignments done. So if you had a faculty member that wasn't assigning them work that was engaging in print collections, they weren't going to do it. You know, that's just, they're not necessarily in the space to go above and beyond and engage in that kind of work, especially in the first few years of their academic career. Now, if students moved into some of the more humanities or some of the social sciences, where they might get involved in a senior essay project and other type of research, that kind of thing would drive them to start engaging with print collections a little bit more, but that certainly wasn't all subject areas. So we understood that. We actually did a bunch of studies where we observed people studying the space, and less than 20% of the time did anybody have any kind of printed material at their desk. So they would be there with their laptop, maybe a pile of papers, but very rarely would they have a book. And if they did have a book, it usually was very obviously a textbook of some sort. So it wasn't necessarily one of the print collections. Now, there are always exceptions, keep that in mind. But that's what we were finding when we were doing our studies. So doing that participatory design process, very similar to what Brad showed on some of those boards there, trying to get people's feedback, we got some understanding that undergraduates, when they design the library of their dreams, often would have lots of individual study spaces. If they had books, they would often draw them in, and then when they talked about it, it's like, well, you really need to have books because it's a library, but I just want to, but they would often talk about it in terms of decoration, and not about what the collections were, or actually engaging with those ideas or that content in any kind of significant way. And so that was the reality that we were facing. We had some ideas about trying to build in some new engagements as we thought about reimagining not only the library, but also reimagining the collections that were going in there. We put together our ideas. We're like, I said, the faculty advisory committee is on board. We put together ideas, we've gotten together, we have some innovative programs to talk about with faculty that will hopefully help to maybe get them to engage with this conversation about print collections with students. Great to go. We are doing our presentation, and then we ran into a little bit of an issue. And the issue is that there was a very active student who happened to be an op-ed columnist at the Yale News. This was kind of like a perfect storm. You not only somebody at the Yale News, but an op-ed columnist at the Yale. He had to write, again, a Friday column every week that he could rail on about something. And he really started to fixate on the library and what was going on here. Now, this student was very much embedded in this what I would call an old idea of libraries, and this sort of reference for the print book is this sacred object, and that the reality was is you were supposed to make as many of these objects available for people to browse and to and that they would engage in that kind of, they would browse the shelves and find these treasures, and it would be an incredible experience. And I have no doubt that that might be his experience, but that definitely was not the experience that we were observing for most of the students. And also is not necessarily a realistic way to be able to manage collections that are as enormous as the one that Yale is managing. So the reality is, like, he wants all of these, like this idea that the vast library, which has the capacity to hold at the point before the renovation, 150,000 volumes, it is like less than 1% of the entire collection of Sterling Memorial Library. And it was just not realistic that this was going to be this beautiful and representative and the best of the best. That's not what this library was. And it had not been that it had never been that. And the ideas that were going into that were really unrealistic. And so, but he had this idea that this was, so he drew up his own designs. And the designs for his library increased the number of books in the vast library to exceed away, which is kind of a little bit problematic. What happened, though, is that even though he'd done all this work with the students and with the faculty, there were some faculty that still were very much against this proposal. A faculty that adopted the vast library as their collection, they sort of been in communication with the librarian, and they really built out certain aspects of the collection. And so that library became very skewed, especially towards language and literature, because it was the English department that adopted the library. And they basically started partnering with the op-ed columnists, and they started to write op-eds as well. It felt like, it really sort of came to a head. We had announced that the library would be closed during the summer and fall of 2019, and that's when sort of all heck broke loose. Between the op-eds and a couple of protests that were arranged by the student, we were feeling a little bit under the gun. We didn't quite know what to do. We really went into damage control. As part of this process, I actually had put together a feedback form, and we received about 100 requests within the span of a couple of days after some of these op-eds had appeared. And when we started analyzing that data, we realized that what came to light was really interesting. Most of the students were not actually angry about the books. Some of them mentioned the books, but most of them were angry that the library was going to be closed in the fall semester. This was their study space. So that was really what was activating it. Why are you doing this? This is going to completely disrupt me. And we realized that we had an option here. And so we activated an option. Basically, working with the planners, we said, look, I think we can do this in the summer. This was just not a major gut of a library. This was more of I would call it, a renew and refresh of the library. And so we were able to we basically did an accelerated build, and we did it all in the summer. Once we made that announcement, honestly, most of the controversy really died down. But the faculty that were super upset about this whole process really became real difficult to deal with. They were disrupting frontline services desks. There were some faculty that made some statements that were so outrageous that we actually reported them to campus police. And so, it just became, it was such a really interesting study, and have something that's so small. And so it seems like it should be non-controversial, but it was they became so tied to their identity that they really started to behave irrationally. We ended up having to they actually had to the provost had to put out a letter to the faculty to talk about civility, which everybody was mystified. Why is this happening? This seems so like such a non-controversial issue. But, again, with the hype and the sort of the idea of this viral campaign that really sort of took to the streets, so to speak, it became a really easy thing to talk about with faculty. And, we're managing a lot of different things. Once that letter came out and the controversy died down, we felt like, all right, we can breathe. Everybody graduated. The project went into place. We did a refresh of the library, and everything was basically we resolved. We have a beautiful new space. It is incredibly popular. When the students came back in the fall, it's been extremely positively taken in from the students. A lot of the faculty faculty, even some of the faculty that were concerned, they were sort of reluctantly, oh yeah, it actually is really nice, so some of that. It's not an airport lounge, that was one of the things that they were threatening to call it. They just, everything, they started imagining a disaster that was completely way beyond anything that we were actually planning to do. So, success. One of the things that was really interesting about this whole project, however, was trying to figure out ways of engaging into conversation with collections. And so we actually developed some new programs, some things that are brand new. Something called the Model Research Collection, which is a partnership with a faculty member, to basically bring the idea of conversation pieces around books into the space. Developing themes around books, bringing books from entirely different parts of the library together to really show that our library is not one stacks of books, because this idea that everything is going to be available in one place is not realistic in the modern world of libraries, and it's never been realistic in a place like Yale, which has so many different libraries and so many rich collections all across campus and in remote shelving facilities. And so we were trying to bring some of that into these innovative programs. Thinking about books as conversation pieces, actually using books to connect with librarians in different subject areas, these types of innovations we're hoping will take hold and hopefully build a better conversation around collections in the future. I think that a lot of the lessons that we learned around this project is that we think about library collections very differently than our users do. Our users, when they think about them, are not thinking about them with the same sort of depth and concern that we often are. They think about libraries as places that they can get content, places that make them feel smart because there's lots of books around. There's this identity around libraries where libraries equals books, and it's very hard to change that. And so thinking about ways of making that picture bigger instead of trying to change it completely, I think is something that we're really focused on. I think the reality is that when we went into this project initially, we didn't have a lot of really clear ideas about what this project was going to mean for the collections as a whole. It really allowed us time to really think about it deeply and to put some better strategies around collection maintenance in a very public area, which was a real issue in Bass Library. One of the things that was really hard about Bass Library Collections is that they had defined the collection in their minds, the faculty member had defined the collection in their minds, but the librarians had no idea what the Bass Library was supposed to be. It had been stewarded in a very irregular way over the past 10 years. The librarian that was responsible for managing a lot of the collections retired a few years back, and there was never really anybody to take his place. It was kind of a little bit of an orphan in the system, and not having a clear idea really hampered our communications around that space. And finally, campus politics. This was a weird scandal. It popped up at a time when there were some real serious scandals happening on campus. We had Brett Kavanaugh hearings around that time period. There was an enormous sexual harassment in the medical library. Oh, and then we had like varsity blues that also was happening around a little bit around this time. The paying for your kids to go to college. Lots of great things happening. But this scandal just kind of really hit. It was very low stakes, very easy to understand, and it really had some traction for a short period of time. If you don't have the political will behind you to get through a scandal like this, it can actually really, it could ruin people's careers. And things like this have happened in the past. I feel like we were a little bit, even though we knew that there was resistance, I'm not sure we realized how much was going to happen here. But the reality is that if you have the political will to get through it, you can often come out on the other side a lot stronger and a lot more knowledgeable about what you need to do going forward. But it's really hard to gauge that because it's really not just about the politics internally, but it's also the politics on your campus. Do you have the support from the deans and the provosts? Do you have that kind of support? And if this gets really irritating, are they going to drop you? Which is, I think, something that can happen. All right, and I'm going to move over to another interesting story from Michael Meth.
All right, set up. How's everybody? Over there? So, our story
State is probably a lot less controversial. It's not probably, it is a lot less controversial. It's much more of a story of in progress, slowly unfolding in probably a much more controlled way than these topsy-turvy things. That is not to preempt that this could not happen to us. So, you know, keep that in mind. I have a few colleagues from Florida State here in the audience too, so they can set the record straight on anything that they might feel that I represent differently. But I think our story is a tale of data and communication, transparency. A big part of it is also time and patience. And the last part is a vision, which is actually very much still evolving for us. Just quickly for context, in the top left you see Stroger Library. That's our main undergraduate library, mostly used by undergraduates, I would say. Also obviously offers all the range of services. It was built in the 1950s, and it was added on with an annex, which is really where most of the books are stored. We have a little bit over 1 million volumes in print over there. Then we also have holdings in remote storage, where we recently installed compact shelving. And then we have a science library called the RAC that was built in the 1980s. One of the things that is very evident from all of this that you need to keep in mind is, of course, that we're a very different campus, very different size institution when all these buildings were built to get us to where we are. The bottom right is actually something that sits on top of the old original library, which is Dodd Hall. It says, and sorry, I didn't realize what the lighting would be in the setup here, so you probably can't read any of this stuff. But it says the half of knowledge is to know where to find knowledge. And I think in terms of our conversation, as we're talking about holdings, and particularly, we're talking about our physical holdings, this is just so appropriate for me that this was installed somewhere in the 1930s or so. And here it is still holding so very, very true. So the prelude to our process started in 2016 when the QER process for us was completed. This was the first QER, quality enhancement, in 10 years. Our reviewers came and we got obviously very good grades because we're awesome. But what they also told us is that they did a count, and they counted that we have 2,634 seats in our two main libraries that could house only 6% of the student population at a time. And as you can see, it's well below the Council of Educational Facility Planner standards, etc. It should say 12% of the undergraduate population and 30% of the graduate population. To put this differently in context, we have about 1.6 million visits to our libraries on an annual basis, and our daily counts can exceed 10,000 easily. So we are, if you're talking about maybe turning inventory over, we're turning over these seats 4 times a day easily in a 24-hour period. The QER also found that we don't have enough instructional room. Actually, let me see if this works. Oh, it works, perfect. And this was the one that was really interesting for us. So the reviewers told us that they believe approximately 20 to 25% of the stacks in Stroger could be annexed, creating our prime real estate for additional student seating and displaced staff departments. The displaced staff departments is a reference to the fact that we have staff that are dispersed across different buildings. Most notably our technical services, or RMATs, resource management and discovery services, is in a building that is near campus, technically off campus, close enough, but one of those things that you can't actually ride a golf cart there unless it's street legal. So that's one of that things. And 20 to 25% of our stacks in Stroger Library, which is the main building that I showed you earlier, again, depending on how you count, if you go by that 1 million number, we're talking about 200 to 250,000 volumes, roughly, that we were suggested to remove. So the first step that happened after the QER, which, we were proud of the overall results, and we took it to the provost and talked to her. And this was something that she then said, all right, she gave us the blessing. And before the whole project even started, we started sharing that information with our librarians, and faculty, and staff in the libraries. And that was a conversation with what I call our internal stakeholders. And what we have to do is understand, first of all, who are all the different people that have to participate in this conversation. Because like all of the libraries, we have different silos or different verticals, depending on how well you communicate with each other. We have to figure out how we're going to work across. We also had to overcome, as again, all of you probably know, memories in libraries are very long. So the RAC, the science library, had a read that long predates my time at FSU, but people were still very much remembering it. It was a process that did not go well. Pretty much almost all the books were removed from the RAC and just became a journal holding facility. So there were some memories of that. Then there were concerns for our scholars about access and completeness of our collections. And then there was probably the last part, which was the most interesting one to see, because this again predates the formation of our project. This was purely a response to a 20-25% reduction suggestion, was the anticipation of conflict with faculty. And I will say to credit, and again, knowing that two of our librarians are here, to our credit of our librarians, I mean, this was, I think, a genuine concern in two ways. One, I think it was the ownership they felt about collections that we had. And the other part was the anticipation of how the faculty would feel if we went and we slashed 20% of our collection. Of course, one of the underlying first assumptions was that we had to address was, if it says 20%, it doesn't mean we're just going to take, 1/5 of the books out of the library. There's got to be a process that identifies which books are coming out, which journals are coming out, which help docs are coming out, all that kind of stuff. That led us then, in 2017, to form a group called the Collections Conversations. No reference to the past conversations in collections, or about collections slide that we just saw a second ago. This was still an internal group that we formed, and I want to point out that we didn't call it like a meeting conversation or anything like this. This was really something that we realized as we embarked on this conversation in the post-QER, but pre-formation of this group, is that really we hadn't had good conversations about collections in our libraries. We had not engaged in any significant maintenance projects in a very long time. I kind of like to make this analogy, so forgive me if you don't like it, but it's kind of like the sock drawer, and you keep on buying like 5 pairs of socks every year. Eventually things are going to burst and you're not wearing them all. We did not have those conversations about what does the process look like that will allow us to do regular maintenance. What does the process look like that actually tells us what our shelves and our stacks look like? I'll show you some numbers in a minute and some visualizations that we create to show that our stacks are, in some cases, we're 105% filled, right? Like, it's just not sustainable. And so we formed a team out of that included librarians. So we had subject librarians there, we had folks from collection development, we had some technology task people, technology and digital scholarship for us. We had staff involved in the project. It was very important for us that we really had good across-the-board representation, because we want to make sure that there's buy-in and that we have a complete project plan where there's an understanding that there are all kinds of folks that have to play different roles. And we wanted to also, of course, make sure our library leadership was included. So everybody from the dean and the associate deans, for the most part, were represented. We started having regular meetings. And the discussions at the beginning were very much about trying to identify tools and methods and sort of the different analytical methods that we could use in order to get there. So at the end of the day, what we're really trying to figure out is what evidence do we have to support the decision-making that had to go into making, 20% reduction, and to hopefully lead us to a recurring project that is maintainable and sustainable in the long run. So we had to look at our, often in the analysis section, legacy collections. So what did we collect? Because once upon a time we had faculty who were really strong in their field, but have since left, retired, whatever, and we still have these collections. We had to look at the data. A big challenge that we have is that our circulation data is in a state-owned repository, basically, for data that runs the entire state of Florida. It was very hard for us to pull data from that data warehouse. And the other thing that we learned in that process is that there was a data migration in 1997. So all pre-1997 collections data was given a 1997 start date. So that's all of our circulation basically was just lumped in together there. We ended up doing a collections analysis using a software tool called Greenglass, and then ended up joining EAST, which is the Eastern Academic Scholars Trust, which now has a Florida cohort, so now we're in this whole process. This is all still ongoing stuff, by the way. We're still in it, but that led us then to retention agreements, which again helped us identify, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of stuff. What we ended up with, and again, I apologize, these slides I believe are uploaded. Is that correct? They will. They will be. So you can see this, and if you want to see more of this, but we ended up coming up with a bunch of different ways of looking at our collections data, and I just want to show you some of the visualizations, so maybe this is useful, maybe not, you can let me know afterwards. But basically what we did is we broke down the call number ranges, and in this case I'm just showing you A to AZ. I'm formerly Canadian, so I still like to say AZ, but I'll say AZ for the benefit of this room. And what we did is we basically, oops, that went the wrong way. Does this thing have a laser? There's a laser. All right, so we looked at some statistics just at the top to pull it out, which looked in that A to AZ range, what was the max circulation of any one item? And it was 135 times. It was A Tale of Genji, a novel in 6 parts by Lady Murasaki, translated from Japanese. Why this one is a thing? That's one of the things that the data doesn't tell us. We just know that was 135 times circulated. We also know on the 14,656 titles that we have in A to AZ, the average circulation on those titles was 1. And that was a round one. So then we broke it down a little bit further. You can see the breakdown over here, which basically shows you circulation call numbers by, you see the one item like 135 times, and you kind of see the number over here that is starting at 1, and we didn't run it all the way to 0 because the graph would just blow up. But what it shows you is basically between the total titles in that collection, which is 14,656, and the circulation had 3,384 titles, so about a quarter or so, that circulated at least once. Okay? That was 23% of that collection has circulated once, at least once. When we broke it down, looked at which of these titles out of that subset actually circulated twice, we now get down to 14%. Out of that subset, which ones actually made it 3 times, 10%, etc. So what it shows us is that, first of all, 77% of our collection never circulated as far as the data that we have from our circulating system. So 3/4 of our collection never even had any tracked circulation. Now, there could be data errors, but that's kind of what that indicates. And then we, again, looked at these breakdowns and we found that the majority of what we had basically circulated 1, maybe 2 times, and then the drop-off was again pretty extreme. So that was one way that we looked at the data, and we did that for all the call number ranges. Faster, talking too much. Second thing that we did is we actually looked at our different areas in the library. We had different West 1, East 1, so we kind of made the groupings of spaces that we had. And we broke down basically the yellow line indicates what 75% of the stack would be where we should be. Everything in red is where we're over, and then green was potential free space. So you can see not everything was past capacity when you look at it in the aggregate, but you can see that most of our areas were above where they should be if we're aiming for 75% full stacks. The next thing that we did is we broke it down further, so we took those areas and actually recreated basically what our stacks would look like. So you can see the beginning of where the stack starts, what the call number is, and to the end. Again, you will be able to see from where you are. But you can see then what we did is the red line is the breakdown where in that particular area of the library where the 75% mark is, and you can see again a good number of them are well past 75%, and this is just for A to AZ. I didn't go to the other ranges. Once we get heavy into like the PRs, PSs, you know, we get the humanities sections, the heavy stuff, we're way past. So that was our own analysis that we worked on. Now we took that, and once we had this data, we had done a lot of the background work that we needed to do to give ourselves the ability and confidence to go out and talk. We approached this whole thing through what I like to think is transparency, what we all like to think is transparency. So one caveat, we don't have a fancy website that gives you all this data, it's still internal. But what we want to do is make sure that our librarians have the talking points they need when they're talking to faculty. We engage the Faculty Senate Libraries Committee. They've been a great sponsor and supporter of us. We have in the past couple of years had big deal cancellations with Springer, which we got back in, Elsevier, where you've heard that thing. We're not back in yet, or again, or maybe never will, who knows, this is recorded, okay? But basically what it gave us is gave us communication protocols to work with the Faculty Senate. And the Faculty Senate supported the report that was created by the Faculty Senate in consultation with the libraries. And that report looks something like this. It was published in 2018. And the key sentence, or the first sentence here is the mission of the FSU library system includes keeping the libraries current with research library practices. And I think that is perhaps the most telling part, that if you go back to the original thing that we had about the original library, half of knowledge is to know where to find it, you know, we want to be current in that. I would also say that a large part of what prevented us from having opposition at this point, and don't get me wrong, we did have a couple of faculty members who cried foul and made the impassioned appeal to not get rid of any of the books, so the students have really not been that much concerned about this. It just hasn't seemed to be much of an issue for them. They're really very, very concerned. You saw the numbers earlier, we're getting seating. And the other part that has helped us is that we have a very successful library delivery services to faculty offices. So the majority of faculty, even if their offices are close to the library, don't actually come to the library, which you can feel about how you want about that. I kind of want to come more to the library. I think it's good for students to see the faculty come in, all that kind of stuff. But the library has not a ton of incentive to come the faculty has not a ton of incentive to come to the library unless the library comes to them. The last thing is just current development. So where we're sitting right now is, so again, we started 2016 with the QER, and this will be the part where patients comes in and doing the homework. We're executing the plan right now to reduce physical collections. We had to consolidate some remote storage facilities into one. We installed the compact shelving, like I said. So now we're starting to move things off the shelves and redirecting, and that will eventually lead to a big shift. And we're aiming for eventually freeing up about 20,000 square feet of floor space, which will significantly help us with addressing the need for seating for students. Where we have a challenge is that it's great. I mean, we can push the project faster. We can pay for it, and then the stacks are empty, and we can even remove the stacks. But doing renovations, updating the space, doing all that stuff actually takes a lot of money and a lot of vision. So we recently had a meeting with the provost office. They have actually set aside about $2 million for a renovation. What we don't know yet is what that's actually going to cover, because just to take up the stacks, hopefully not get into asbestos, remediation projects, then painting them, installing new lighting, then picking up furniture, etc. is going to eat that money. I mean, $2 million sounds like a lot of money, but if you've done a library renovation, that money goes like that. So we're working on a wish list, which includes additional seating, classrooms. We want to make a nicer special collection space. We have hopes for a faculty lounge, bringing faculty in, all these kind of things, and that's all unfolding. So please stay tuned, and thank you very much. Over to Boaz.
I'm going to try and be quick because we want it to be a lively discussion. But you may know me for a while. I used to work at Cornell University for around 12 years, Brown University for 4 years, OCLC for a couple of years, and I'm the university librarian here in Lehigh. Obviously I'm not going to take on anything crazy, like removing lots of stuff right now, because one of the things I need to do is to learn who we are working with and addressing some of the things that were raised here to make sure that there is enough political might and interest in making sure that they get what they want, and to remind me and everybody else, students are our friends, faculty are our friends. So if, one thing that we probably need to kind of remember is how to engage with them as early as possible and to bring them into thinking, kind of design thinking about the space, and not to kind of wait till you have the plan, you come up with, here is the chart, here is the stats, this is what, because that's probably already too late. But there is, Cornell actually, at the time, it's a folklore kind of thing. Librarians remember those battles very well. So it's not just, faculty that are, remembering that, 20 years ago somebody got removed, but librarians are in a really weird position, and we're putting them there knowingly and without much thought, I believe, being in the midst of administration, trying to launch a project, and staffers that need to represent their faculty as best as they can. And in between, there is an issue of trust, and how do staff react to management asking to do things like that, and how do faculty interact with the librarians. So all of this needs to be worked on an ongoing basis to kind of make sure, I believe, that staff are with you as you go about kind of big, things like that. Talking points are great, but in order for the talking points to be addressed well. You need to have enough culture that supports the librarians all the time to feel like they're in, this all makes sense. So Lehigh, this is an example, of a situation like that, maybe. So this is the Lindemann Library, 1877. Wonderful, beautiful library, considered to be the hub of humanities, and we have first years and graduate students and faculty members that go there. They love it. This reading room is amazing and one of the most beautiful reading rooms in the US. Actually, very attractive to even start a job there. So my office is here, and this is this is the offer faculty event that we do once a year. All the the faculty offers that wrote something, a monograph in the past year, we meet with them in the Lindemann and we celebrate with them their scholarly output. So this is kind of the symbolic hub of Lehigh. And then there is the Virtual Martindale. The Virtual Martindale is this big building on the left that is representing more of the event and sort of a partnership place. This is where all of this collaboration happens. We have students that are feeling very much at home there. They live there. We have hundreds of thousands of people just sitting there and having a great time and working together. So, this is an event opening cafeteria. It's no problem. This is an event celebrating a diverse house, a very inclusive space. We try to make it even more appealing to students, and group studies and all of that. So, between this and that, there is a cultural gap. And in order to make that happen, you need to apply some strategies to kind of make sure that you continue to build that culture of partnership, inclusiveness, and all of that, and try to verge between the two cultures as much as possible. So some points that, I thought I wanted to say. First, it's a great story. This whole kind of, what I think Sarah was saying, everybody was talking about it. There were other many things happening, but it's a simple enough story. The library is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, so everybody kind of understands it. It captures the imagination. So we need to talk in the same way. If this is simple and we know what they talk about, everybody thinks where the trust, something is going wrong. We need to maybe strengthen vision and values and, thinking, what is this stuff going to contribute to the whole campus in mission vision statements that work very well, aligning it with the whole campus mission vision. So where the library is and where the university is, if we jump to the university, then it's easier to explain things that we want to do on the kind of local library thing. Another thing I thought, maybe there is a way to replace inclusion with inclusion and exclusion with exclusion. So if we're thinking about, okay, this is a place where most faculty love to hang out because they have their individual study and all of that, maybe this is where graduate study room and kind of a way that is more sort of clustering, the work around this particular space and kind of saying you're not losing your sense of belonging to a certain place in this library, but we're strengthening it actually by allowing you to be, selective on how it's going to be, what furniture is going to be there, what type of collections are going to be there. So not to say we're not thinking about you as a group anymore, thinking we want you to be a group celebrating here at the library, but here is some other ways maybe that we can help you kind of doing those things. I thought about, so office shelves and all of that. So I think it was Sarah saying we're bringing together things from different places in the libraries to exemplify, that it's not a stable place. there is a lot of kind of ongoing flexibility going on. So, Student Library Advisory Board that we just started, they're taking part in selecting the books that they think their peers are going to be interested in. So more ownership is kind of given to students, given to faculty, instead of it being us kind of trying to do that. Consortial arrangement, so I think what you said about 1977 onwards, or the MARC records that I know. So this was, we are part of East, we're part of Gold Rush now. We want to make sure that the data is not talking about just Lehigh, but talks about East, talks about, the bigger picture. So you have enough access to everything you want, even if it's not going to be on the shelf. Partnerships in that level, I think, are really kind of effective if you have a service that is very quick, like an Amazon turnaround and paging and all those things. So those are just some ideas. The Cornell experience was very painful. I think that the university librarian at the time didn't expect that at all. So she went to, a faculty meeting in the humanities, and suddenly everybody was very upset because there was I think the decision was to sell copy 3 and 4 or something to China, and obviously that didn't go that well at that time. But as a staff member there, I remember that kind of weirdness about us not having the politics that we were supposed to have anyway. You kind of assume that relationship is ongoing and disruption of this is not going to show up, and suddenly it does. And same happened at Brown, where union situations kind of amplified the whole, kind of removal of material from the science library, and lots of union staff collaborated with the movement, the student movement, to protest, against what was going on there. So it's multi-layered, and there are many, many connections that need to be made before that we're ready to kind of take on something like that. But now it's your time, so give us some, good ideas and anything you want to share, or that was kind of what we wanted to do.
Yep. Thanks.
Is there a mic?
We have one here. I looked this up with a different illustration. We got Banksy instead of Eva Vendetta. So we'd like to throw flowers instead of bombs.
And I made Boaz go last because I cut them off. All right. So thoughts, questions. I mean, this is obviously 4 very different kinds of stories and contexts, but I'm curious from all of you whether this is an opportunity you'd like to share, or even just sort of thinking about what are good approaches in how we have to reimagine our spaces and collections and how we deal with our constituents. So open the floor.
You never did anything like that, right?
Yeah, please.
I don't want to, but we're going through all of that in Montana State, so we just emptied the floor. Our students came back in the fall, where the books, we had just moved into the 3rd floor and down to the basement, moved our periodicals to offsite storage, so I can resonate with a lot of your stories. Sarah, I have a question for you, because now we have our humanities and outreach librarian who's like, I want to put pocket collections up on the 2nd floor. So we did the same thing. Matthew? Is that your name?
Mike.
Mike, I'm sorry. We developed our committee is called Collections Management Committee, made up of, same as you, where we just look at our library holistically and are making decisions that way. So my question for Sarah is, how did you go out and identify faculty members to create those collections?
Well, we were very strategic about it, because what we did is we developed the idea of this program. This program is called the Model Research Collection, and it's really meant to be an annual project, which would basically show a collection of materials. It could be around a topic area, it could be around a class that other people are taking, we really envisioned it very similar. We actually have a similar program for special collections where students basically do student exhibits. We consider this a book exhibit, where you can bring together collections from around the library and display them as an individual collection. We partnered with a professor named Laura Wexler, and we chose her very deliberately because her programming area, she's actually somebody, she's deeply enmeshed in humanities and in the digital humanities. Her field of study is photography. And so what she does is she teaches classes that have people select photographic images and then does research around them. And not only does it do like research with print collections, but research online as well. So she spearheaded a big digital humanities project called Photogrammer. Some of the images you saw in my slides were related to that particular project. So not only sort of using traditional research techniques, using books and articles and things like that, but also using high-end text mining, data visualization, GIS, that type of thing. So really, not only was it centered in the humanities, centered in the visual arts, which we thought would be an incredibly valuable thing and very attractive for people to basically draw them in. It's like we're drawing them in. We're trying to catch their eyes so people will actually pay attention to something, and that was part of this particular initiative. This is an experiment. Is this going to work? I don't know. We wanted to partner with this faculty member. She's a big supporter of the library. She's used different library services. She worked with multiple libraries in the system. She really exemplified that library as a community, which we thought would be a really good way to kickstart this particular program. So I think that as the work of the committee has drawn down as far as the renovation is concerned, now we are forming that group that's going to sustain this type of programming in an ongoing way. And this idea of how do you draw people to these collections in an ongoing way, you keep the variety up, you keep trying different things, and really trying to merge not only print collections, but visual imagery and conversation around that particular area as well. So this idea too, this collection is not just about books that you would browse, there would be programming throughout the year about that collection. So we'll have, she envisioned doing like fireside chats, where basically, having a little bit of a symposium around a topic area that's related to this collection.
This is part of the kind of work on the event building for the library. So we have a committee, the library, Friends of the Libraries committee. So they're the folks that are working on the spaces in terms of programming events, and that's a way to also address collections, because you kind of bring in art and lectures into the library, and then you're saying, okay, it would be great to have a space that will accommodate us continuing to support that type of activity in the Frederick Martindale, that open space. So there are ways to kind of insert, we work nicely with the galleries in Lehigh to also bring in kind of joint programming across the galleries. It's like an instruction gallery, so folks that come there, come and visit the libraries, and vice versa, so you can have faculty that are kind of bridge between the two sort of kind of different angles of the culture around those spaces. So I found the art department very willing to kind of crosswalk those things.
We do have time for one more question. I'm going to say something provocative at the end, so please.
So in retrospect, could the collections have been managed differently before your renovations to mitigate this? And then going forward in leadership roles, are you looking to manage the collection going forward differently to prevent this to happening to librarians when we're dead?
The answer to both of those questions is yes. I mean, the reality was when we were faced with this project, we were really faced with some gaps in our visioning around the collections in this particular area. And some of it was just organizational structures that were in place in which there was the stewardship of the collection in this particular part of the library had been a little bit neglected over a long period of time. And I think that when something flares up like this, it often is sort of symptomatic of a long-standing problem. And I think that was something that we really wanted to address going forward. It's like, you know, we realized, you know, this was a problem. We knew it was a problem going into it. And I think we understood the depth of the problem much more so than the faculty members who didn't really understand. We knew that this was this sort of benign neglect of the collections in the space really meant that this collection did not have a particular vision, idea, or even a cohesive collection statement around it. And so we really had to make all of those changes, and all those changes have been resulted in a different way of managing that collection going forward, and thinking about collections in Sterling and Bass and Yale Library as a whole, really trying to make sure that we talk about collections in the aggregate, in sort of that big picture about collections, because you know, the idea that one particular space represents all of the knowledge of a particular area is not realistic in this time period. And it hasn't been for many, many years, but people are still very much fixated on that. The arts library has all of the arts books in it. The classics library is the only place you need to go for classics materials, and that's just not the case anymore.
So, and I have to do the wrap-up piece if we're going to be a good moderator, be a jail on time. But you have a couple of things. One, if you do the Harvard Leadership Institute, you get Ohio State as a case study on politics, and I will admit that was good timing for the Bass Project, because I came back going, oh my God, things are really getting out of control, and you don't want that to happen. But I think the point is actually the last point, really. You can anticipate as much as you wish, but things happen. So different approaches. One is walking into something knowing full well you shouldn't do it. Another where it looked like it wasn't a big deal, but it turned into a big deal. Another where you're not quite sure yet. You've done a lot of great homework, and another's like, I'm not touching anything until I understand things better. I think all the approaches are valid. It really depends on your organization. But I really like your last question as far as looking into the future. And so the part I'd like to sort of wrap this up with is that I had an opportunity to talk to Jim McDonald, who's the University Librarian at Arizona State. And what they're doing with their library as it opens in January is quite radical. But it's all based on the premise of an appreciation of print culture. And the idea being is that you take 2.5 million volumes and you boil it back down to just 200,000 to 300,000. And that's actually an appreciation of print culture, not a eradication. And he has great, look at what he says about it, I think is quite inspirational. But one of the things that he said that I think is really telling, and this is the piece I think that we need to keep in mind, is that his concern is much more long-term. What happens, 2, 3 provosts, 2, 3 university librarians from now? We're in a place like Phoenix, Arizona, where they have an off-site storage facility that's being carefully maintained at these low temperatures. And they say, so how many of those books are circulating? And I think that this, we can't just be dismissive of our print collections, because the investments that we have made in them and the long-term strategies that we've made in them as well will get questioned long after we have left. And so I think that we have to be very intentional of having people understand the spectrum and the importance of it, even as we're having to rethink where they're physically housed. So that's a piece, at least, I think that you should think about, aside from look at what Arizona State is doing. I think it's quite inspirational. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. You had very many choices. We're glad you came here and shared your time with us. Have a great rest of the conference.